Hello there, I'm your imaginary friend. I have another story by H.R. Wakefield for you today. Now, as always, bear in mind that sometimes an author will have included something in their work that, at the time of writing, seemed fine to them. That's not always fine. This is called the Cairn. I'd like to go with you, said Welland, but I think I'd better nurse this heel if I'm to get through the rest of the trip. Yeah, certainly, agreed Seabright. You'd be a fool to attempt it, but I like the look of those silvery slopes above the wood. Ever since I was a kid, I've loved high hills and virgin snow. I don't imagine it'll take me more than 4 hours or so up and down. All the same, it might be as well to get one of the locals to go with me. It's easy to miss the shortest way, even on such a simple climb as old Bruden looks to be. Well, ring for our worthy host and see if he can arrange it. Seabright pulled the bell knob, and a moment later the landlord appeared, a tubby, rubicund Midlander, genial and of andante intelligence, and consequently at perfect peace with the world. "Oh, Mr. Riddle," said Seabright, "I'm going to climb Bruden tomorrow. Mr. Welland has a bad heel, and I want a companion. Would someone from the village go with me?" "I don't believe that they would, sir," replied the landlord. "What on earth do you mean? Don't they like the look of me?" Mr. Riddle shifted about on his feet. "It isn't that, sir, but the chaps about here won't climb Bruden when snow's lying." "Why the devil not?" "Well, sir, it's just that way. They won't go beyond the wood on any account, and most of them don't like setting foot on the hill when the snow's lying." "But why? I can't imagine a simpler or easier climb. Is it because it's too much like work?" "No, it ain't that. I'm not a native of these parts, so I don't hear everything, as a local chap would. But they've got some reason why they won't go above dim wood in the snow." "Is that big spinney halfway up dim wood?" asked Welland. "Yes, sir. The fact is, they think there's something that wanders on the slopes above it when the snow's there." "And hides behind the cairn and pounces on the unsuspecting climber?" suggested Seabright, laughing. "Yes," replied Mr. Riddle, looking startled. "That's just what they does think." "Well, I'm damned," said Seabright. "Do they think they've seen it?" "They're pretty close about it, sir. Chaps gets sullen like and changes the subject if it's mentioned, but it seems as though they think they've seen some marks. I gather it's a very old story, a sort of village secret." "Very typical piece of folk funk," said Welland. "A few probably perfectly explainable marks in the snow, and of course the devil or some other undesirable is abroad. Away goes the snow, away goes the marks, and away goes the devil." "Well, landlord," said Seabright, "if you're above that sort of thing, come with me tomorrow and help to lay what must be rather an inconvenient bogey." "Uh, don't believe I will, sir," said Mr. Riddle. "What?" cried Seabright. "You don't mean to say you believe this tripe?" "I don't say I does, but I believe in being on the safe side in such things. I'd do the same if I was you, sir." "Be damned to that. I'll climb Bruden if it snows ink." "As you please, sir. But in any case, you wouldn't want a guide. The way is as easy to find as hard to miss. I'll show you if you look through the telescope. You takes the third turn to the right in the village, dim lane. That takes you up to that big clump of oaks. Then you follows the hedge till you comes to a gate. Then you goes straight up to the wood. There's a path through that, and it's all plain sailing to the cairn. Now I must go and see about your dinners, sir." Pat Seabright and Leonard Welland differed in temperament as much as they differed in their command of this world's goods. Yet to have laid down his life for the other would have been considered a privilege by either of them. If the summons had come, neither of them would have hesitated for a moment. They'd been the fastest, firmest friends for 20 years. Pat made an easy £10,000 a year in his father's stockbroker's firm. Leonard secured from the national income a precarious £250 as an usher in a small school. Yet the overwhelming disparity between their income tax returns had never in the slightest degree tarnished their friendship, and Pat had never lent Leonard a penny. All he had done was to persuade him to allow him occasionally to do a little marginal speculation on his behalf, with a rather mythical £50. These occasional flutters came off in a most magical manner, and every year a most welcome little increment was paid into Leonard's bank. Intellectually, Pat was a child in comparison with Leonard, but in practical affairs of life he was absolutely his master. Each envied and complimented the other. Pat was of an enterprising and inquiring type of mind, and Leonard stimulated and vitalized strata of his brain which would otherwise have perished of malnutrition. Neither was ever quite happy when separated from the other, though an innate sense of the supreme obscenity of sentimentality would ever have prevented them from acknowledging the fact. Their affection for each other so far surpassed the love of woman that they had been forced to face the conventionally considered ultimate test of friendship. By falling in love with the same one, they would have left her to celibacy or a third person with absolute contentment, in the certain knowledge that such a competition would have been essentially discordant and disgusting. Each secretly dreaded the possible marriage of the other, though in the case of poor Leonard, who had to think twice about purchasing packets of cigarettes, and who met about 3 fresh females per annum, such a contingency was highly improbable. As things turned out, there was no need for either of them to worry. They always spent their holidays together, and on this occasion were passing the Christmas vacation in tramping the Lake District. Their time was almost up, for in 3 days' time they were due to drive back to London in Pat's impressive car. Perhaps it was this which seemed to cast a shadow over their dinner together that night. Both felt it and confessed to it. Pat applied his usually infallible antidote to irrational gloom by ordering a bottle of Mr. Riddle's champagne and 2 large glasses of his mediocre port. However, this medicine was not quite as successful as it should have been. The shadow remained. "That's a curious yarn about Bruton in the snow," said Welland. "In other circumstances it would be easier to explain. This alleged bogey might be, let us say, the personified terror of avalanches. But I don't suppose an avalanche has sprayed down Bruton since the end of the Ice Age, and even the traditional memory of the good folk of Borthwaite cannot be as long as that. Still, even on Bruton, a blizzard might not be too pleasant. Are you sure you're wise to go alone?" "Oh, perfectly," replied Seabright. "Anyway, I shan't start if the weather breaks. How's the glass, Mr. Riddle?" "Steady enough, sir. From the looks of the sky, I'd say it will be fine but dullish tomorrow." They went to bed early, and Welland was asleep at once. But his rest was disturbed by the recurrence of a very idiotic little dream. It seemed to him that it was moonlight, that he was gazing through the telescope at the cairn, which was throwing a hard shadow onto the snow. And then this shadow began to move, and as it moved, it changed its shape and became more like a crouching beast of some kind than any such shadow had a right to be. And were those flaming points red eyes? And each time, before he could make up his mind on this, for some reason or other, rather urgent question, he awoke. "Now, I will not dream that again," he said to himself, but a moment later he was once more scrutinizing with a growing anxiety and distaste this erratic and enigmatic shade. After this had happened 5 or 6 times, he sat up in bed. Self-flatterers, he said to himself, would attribute this bother to nerves, honest men to alcohol. What should he do about it? Well, it occurred to him that if he crept very quietly downstairs and swung the telescope onto the cairn and proved to his full consciousness that nothing of the sort was abroad, then his subconscious, or whatever it was, would be convinced that no such wearisome phenomenon, such change of shape, was occurring at the crest of Bruton. The moon was filtering vague rays through light clouds. So much of his dream was true. Well, here was the telescope, and there was Bruton. He put his eye to the lens and swung the glass to the cairn. And then he put it down and rubbed his eyes. And then he took it up again. stared through it intently for a full 20 seconds, and put it down again. Then he returned rather slowly and thoughtfully to bed. Of course, I must be slightly tight, he said to himself. That's why I can't sleep. That's why I see things through telescopes. No more double ports for me. All the same. And for a moment he felt a powerful inclination to go down again and take up the telescope and make quite sure that... He looked at his watch. 5 o'clock. And he did not feel sleepy. He decided to read till it was time to get up, something which would mobilize his powers of concentration. Essays on truth and reality, for example. Once he found himself dozing off, and there was just the vague spectral outline of a cairn and a shadow beginning most exasperatingly to reappear. He pulled himself back to consciousness, and taking each sentence slowly, etched it on his brain. As Mr. Riddle had prophesied, the morning was fine, but overcast. And the glass remaining high, Seabright announced his intention of starting at 12:30. He would reach the wood about 2 o'clock, and the summit about 3:30, just as dark was beginning to fall. There would be enough light to see him down to the wood, and he would be back at the inn before 5. And you can follow my progress, Leonard, through the telescope, he said, and mutter prayers for my safety. Now, Mr. Riddle, are you sure you won't come with me? No, thank you, sir, but if you'd take my advice, you'd change your mind. Why not have a try for some of them ducks on the marsh? I'm going to climb the haunted hill, said Seabright, with the utmost emphasis. I am determined to convince the superstitious natives of these parts that climbing this measly hill with 2 inches of snow on it is not precisely the perilous ordeal they profess it to consider it. I shall, if he appears, tweak the nose of the local bogey, and I'm off to do this now. Very well, sir, replied the landlord, and I wish you luck. Seabright set forth punctually at 12:30, and Welland watched his strong, stocky figure striding away down the village street. As he reached the 3rd turning on the right, he turned and waved. Welland lunched at 1, and afterwards sat down by the telescope and attempted once again to concentrate upon the profound yet racy speculations of Dr. Bradley, but again without much success. His body seemed to protest against its immobility. It joined in a conspiracy with his nervous system to compel fidgets and fussiness and a sort of tingling unease, so that he repeatedly pulled out his watch, and yawned, and lit cigarettes, and shifted his position, and these tendencies developed and became more insistent. They almost took charge of him, and the effort to resist them was exhausting in a small way. Presently he gave up the attempt to read, and took up the telescope. He searched very carefully the slopes between the wood and the cairn. If those weren't footmarks in the snow, what were they? Very possibly the locals were in the habit of pulling Mr. Riddle's, the foreigner's, leg. Certainly someone had travelled those slopes. Those marks were extraordinarily distinct. Would that be due to their size? He looked at his watch again. 5 minutes to 2. Pat should be appearing at any moment now. Looking through a small telescope like this was a damn tiring business. There he was. As he came out from the wood, Welland saw him pause. He's looking at those footprints. Or whatever they are, he thought. Seabright remained peering down for half a minute or so, and then began climbing steadily again. Welland found he could just follow him with the naked eye, so he put down the telescope. Mr. Riddle came in just then. How's he getting on? He asked. He should be at the top in 20 minutes or so. The landlord seemed not quite at his ease. Getting a bit misty near the cairn, isn't it, sir? Yes, replied Welland. The clouds are coming down. Looks like a change in the weather, I fancy. Well, sir, I shall be in the kitchen for a bit yet. Would you mind letting me know when Mr. Seabright gets back to the wood again? All right, replied Welland, looking at him a shade sharply. It's just a fancy of mine, sir, said Mr. Riddle, if it's no bother. And he went out again. Welland watched the little dark speck climbing steadily towards the cairn, till it was but 100 yards or so from it, and then once again put the telescope to his eye. A few minutes later he saw Seabright reach the cairn, slap it with his hand, and then turn and face towards the inn, and wave his right arm above his head. Then he began rapidly to descend. Welland had started instinctively to wave back, and then had smiled at his stupidity. He was just about to put the glass down again when he suddenly became tense and intent. He put the telescope down sharply and rubbed both lenses with his handkerchief, and then he put it to his eye again. For a moment he remained taut and rigid, and then he began to tremble, and then he dropped the telescope to the floor, and then he rushed from the room, out through the front door, and down the village street. As it happened, there was only one person who saw him pass, old Mrs. Elm, who was beating a rug outside her cottage door. When she saw a hatless figure dash hobbling past, and that queer look on his face, too, her mouth fell open, and the rug dropped from her hands. A moment later she saw this figure turn up the lane and disappear, and for several minutes she remained staring, open-mouthed. Now, Mrs. Elm's brain never exceeded Largo in its tempo, and seldom reached it. At the same time, she had a sense for the unusual. She went back to her kitchen and wrestled with the problem of what to do. So presently she put a shawl round her head and trotted up to the Hare and Form, where she found Mr. Reddle squeezing the digestive apparatus from a chicken. "Mr. Reddle," she began, and fiddled with her shawl. "Yes, what is it?" asked the landlord, pausing in the middle of his culinary business. "Well," said Mrs. Elm, "I sees one of those young chaps who's putting up here, and I sees him running by in his slippers and without his hat, and he turned up dimly, and I thought I ought to tell you." Mr. Reddle stared at her a moment. Then he rushed past Mrs. Elm into the guest parlor, stood stock still for a moment, gazing round the room, and noticed the end of the telescope sticking out from beneath the table. He picked it up, stared for a moment through it at the dusk-rimmed crest of Brewden, and then rushed through the front door and down the village street. By a lucky chance he met the local representative of law and order, Constable Lamb. Mr. Reddle clutched his arm. "I think there's maybe something wrong on Brewden," he said. "Maybe something's happened to those young chaps staying with me." Mr. Lamb stared at him sharply, but something in Mr. Reddle's face, and a rather disturbing memory which had often recurred to lubricate the somewhat sluggish machinery of his imagination, prevented him from asking some rather natural questions. All he said was, "We'd better see if the doctor's in." They ran together down the street to where a brass plate announced that R. Ford, M.D., physician and surgeon, had there his habitat. He was in, and he did ask a few questions, but his natural skepticism was also diluted with a certain memory. And presently he picked up his bag, his hat and coat, and an electric torch, and started off with the other two. Soon they were climbing in panting silence through the dusk, and the doctor's torch faintly revealing the way. They had just reached the last turn on the path through dim wood when the doctor stumbled over something. "Just describe to us, Constable, exactly how you found the deceased," said the coroner. "Well," said Mr. Lamb, "Mr. Seabright was lying on his back, his arms thrown out like, and Mr. Welland was about 6 yards away. He was lying on his face, more crouching than lying, but his face was in the snow. They'd both fallen hard." "Did you examine the snow for tracks of a third person?" "Yes, sir." "Did you find anything?" "No, sir." "You saw tracks of Mr. Seabright going up and coming down to the wood, but nothing else?" "Nothing else, sir." Dr. Ford was the next witness. "Dr. Ford," said the coroner, "I take it you have performed an autopsy on the deceased?" "I have." "Would you tell the court what you learned from so doing?" "Both were strong, healthy young men, organically flawless. They had sustained extensive superficial injuries, bruises, and so forth, and Mr. Welland had a broken arm. These injuries were consistent with the fact that they'd been thrown down with great violence." "Were these injuries sufficient to cause death?" "No, emphatically not." "Then can you suggest why these two young men died. Frankly, I cannot. It is conceivable that some very violent shock, sudden terror, for example, may have resulted in heart failure in each case. When I say conceivable, I mean just possible, but I'm at a loss for a convincing explanation of their deaths. I've known no parallel case. Is Mr. Reddle here? Asked the coroner. Mr. Reddle was, and returned to the box. Mr. Reddle, as I understand it, Mr. Welland had decided not to accompany Mr. Seabright on this climb? Yes, sir. He'd hurt his heel. Then the fact that he suddenly made up his mind to go to meet his friend was a complete surprise to you? Yes, 'twas, sir. Can you account for it? No. But I think he'd been watching Mr. Seabright through the telescope. Well, what's that got to do with it? Mr. Reddle was silent for a moment, searching for words. I should say nothing, sir, like as not. I only mentioned it, sir. The coroner drummed on the table, but there was otherwise no sound. From outside there came the light crack of a whip and the slow rumble of wheels. Well, said the coroner at length, this seems to me an extraordinarily unsatisfactory affair. All I can do is to express my profound sympathy with the parents of these poor young men, and here he bowed to 4 persons in deep mourning, and to express my hope that further light will be eventually shed on this highly mysterious and tragic affair. But I see no object in adjourning the inquest. The verdict was open. Mr. Riddle followed P.C. Lamb out of the court, and suggested to him that he should come up to the Hare and Form and have some refreshment. The constable had no objection whatsoever. When they were seated in the parlour and furnished with some glossy old pewter, Mr. Riddle said, "You didn't tell the whole truth and nothing but it at the inquest, did you, Mr. Lamb?" The constable put down his mug and looked suspiciously at the landlord. "How's that?" he said. "What makes you for to say that?" "Because I was watching you through the glass when you climbed Rudin this morning, after we found those poor young chaps." The constable shifted uneasily in his chair. "If I tell you what I see, will it go no further? Will you keep your tongue quiet about it?" he said at length. "I'll do that," replied Mr. Riddle. "Well," said Mr. Lamb, "a year or two afore you came, there was a London chap found dead in the wood, and that time I did tell all I'd seed. The chief constable sent for me to Rendell and asked me a lot of questions. And at the end of it he said with a laugh, 'They brew strong ale in Borthwaite, don't they?'" "What did you say to make him laugh?" "I said I'd seen marks in the snow, coming along behind the marks made by the London chap." "What sort of marks?" "I don't believe I'll be after saying what those marks was like. I don't somehow feel like doing it. Not out loud, that is. But I'll say this. It seemed to me that whatever made those marks, some of the time made 4, and not 2 of them. Sort of crouched down like a time or 2. "Maybe that," replied the constable. "About those tracks," said the landlord, "you could make out the ones Mr. Seabright made up and down?" "Yes, I could." "Would you say he noticed anything? I mean, anything that might have to do with them other marks?" "Well," said Mr. Lamb, "he went up steadily enough, but after he'd come down a couple of 100 yards, I judged he'd stopped and looked around. Well, you could tell that plain enough, and then he'd started to run." "Started to run, did he?" exclaimed Mr. Riddle. "That was easy to read, too. His stride got longer, and he came down harder, and he kept up the running till he got to the top edge of the wood, where we found him. And just as he got there, I take it as Mr. Welland met him, and Mr. Seabright stopped, and the 2 of them faced up to whatever, well, to whatever there was to face up to." That's what they would have done, said Mr. Riddle emphatically. I guess that's the rights of it. They'd face up to it together. And then there was a long silence in the heron form. Snow's off, Bruden, now, I take it? Asked the constable at length. Yes, said Mr. Riddle. I looked through the glass at around dinner time, and even that last big patch around Cairn's melted.